All right, today we're doing something a little bit different. Today, this video is meant to be a companion piece to a podcast we put out today titled Building a Better Mana Base. Now, in this video, we're going to be going through two case studies for Historic. We have two decks that we put together that don't have any lands put in yet. And the whole purpose of this video is for you to look at those decks, build the mana base yourself, and then come back and listen to us go through our process for building the mana base. So you can hopefully learn the things we're thinking about and just generally get better at building a mana base. I don't know if you've ever felt lost when trying to build the deck yourself and not really sure if you're meeting your color requirements or not. Well, in this video, we're going to be going through exactly what our process is and the numbers we're looking for when we're trying to hit color requirements based on what cards we're playing in the deck. And hopefully this is really helpful. If you like this kind of video, shoot us a like, subscribe to the channel, let us know in the comments. And if you come to a different mana base than the one we end up on at the end of the video, definitely leave it in the comments and let us know what you thought, why you think yours works a little bit better, because I mean, there's always room for improvement and we could be wrong. It's hard to say if a mana base is really that good without any testing. And this is all kind of theoretical based on, you know, what we think mathematically is required for our mana base to function in a normal game of Magic. So follow along with the case study, make the mana base yourself before watching through and looking at the process, and definitely let us know what you thought about the video. And don't forget, if you want to find more content from the DWC, we stream every Wednesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, twitch.tv/Disorganized Wizards Club. You can find our podcast on our website and every major podcast platform, dwc.gg, and the podcast is the Disorganized Wizards Club podcast. Anyway, without any further ado, let's get right into the video and to the case study. Pull up our Twitter page right now at DWC Podcast 1, find a tweet with these two deck lists. And then the whole point of this is for you yourself, pause the episode, build a mana base yourself, and then you can listen to us go through it on the podcast or watch us go through it on YouTube, and then compare where we both ended up at the end of things. So,
other caveat, no promises that these decks are actually good.
Yeah, the point of throwing these decks weren't to have, you know, top tier performing decks in Historic. It was mostly for a thought experiment to throw some weird mana costs into both decks to make it not as straightforward for building the mana base. Both of these decks are three colors. We have a Mardu God Pharaoh's Gift deck, and then we have a Temur. It's called Bootleg Chandra. It's really a Temur Gearhulk deck.
Yeah.
So
this one's sweet. I'll explain it more when we get into it. But I guess before we jump in, some like general notes about building mana bases. For most decks, like 1 and 2 color decks, I think it's not that hard. 1 color decks, it's basically just, do I want utility lands or not? And things like, if you're playing goblins, like the Castle Empress, they're like a free inclusion. Maybe you want a Field of Ruin. A Phyrexian Tower is sort of an innovation, but those mana bases are pretty straightforward. 2 color decks as well. You just sort of play all the duels you can with considerations for how many tap lands you can afford to play, and if you need any utility lands. So the real challenge is in 3 color decks. So both of these are 3 color. And there, the sort of golden standard reference is an article by Frank Karsten, mathematician, member of the Magic community, who worked out a lot of the numbers needed to have like reasonably probable chances of hitting certain mana costs on time. And whether you learn these from the Frank Karsten article or you sort of just pick them up by playing and experimenting, they're sort of now the go-to for most people. So you can reference this article. Some examples from it: if you need to have a colored source on turn 1 to play something like Llanowar Elf, then you should have 14 untapped sources of that color. And then, you know, most of the time you'll be able to have like untapped green on turn 1, play Llanowar Elf. If you need a double color on 3, so say your control and you need to cast Neutralize or Cancel or whatever, you should have 18 blue sources. If you need to say Wrath on 4 and you need 2 colored sources on turn 4, you only need 16 sources. Maybe you need to cast some like Planeswalker that's like 4 generic and a red, then you only need 9 red sources. And so these numbers are all there. You can go reference them. And so most of really building a mana base, at least the way I approach it, is usually I just add in like 4 of every reasonable duel I think I might want to play, and then count through my actual mana requirements and adjust to match these numbers. And then once I've reached there, then I make adjustments between tapped, untapped, maybe fitting in a utility land, etc. I'm not sure if you approach it similarly.
Yeah, of course. How you approach the mana base is going to first off depend on the format and what dual lanes you have access to. Obviously, in a format like Standard, which is constantly rotating, you're going to have better mana in some formats for specific color pairings, and you're going to have worse mana at different points in time, right? So first off, if we're kind of just considering general rules of thumb, just look at what you have access to you, and then you can kind of base what is doable and what isn't based on your card choices for your deck, based on what the sources are, right? So if in some formats, it could be realistic to be more greedy with your mana base because you have a lot more duels to work with. In some formats, you may only have access to one duel, and then, how realistic is it for me? Like if I'm building a green-black deck and I have only one dual land, is it realistic for me to be building a deck where I have, black on turn 2 and then green on turn 3, right? And this is all going to play into what your card choices are, etc. So we wanted to choose Historic specifically for the case study here because you have tons of options right now. And it's a little more, I guess, complicated than it would be for building in a fetch land format, because fetch land formats just kind of make it easy because your mana is always perfect because of fetch lands. But yeah, I would say I agree with you. Step 1, if I'm building, a Mardu deck, since we're talking about one for the case study, I would just kind of like look at all of the possible dual lands I have in those exact 3 color pairings, and then add 4 of everything, and then just kind of work my way down and around based on what my color requirements actually are.
And I mean, so you mentioned fetch lands and like a fetch land format. Most fetch land formats now are like fetch lands alongside fetchable dual lands. And so these same principles still apply. You still should be counting how many color requirements you have, making sure you have the right number of sources. It's just that when you can fetch duals, your fetch lands become like sometimes 5 color sources, sometimes 4 colors, sometimes all 3. And so they're very dense on how many colors they could provide. And so it makes it very easy to hit all these requirements.
Exactly, yeah. For example, if we're looking at a green-black deck, my Overgrown Tomb is only ever two color sources, right? It's only ever black, green. But if I'm looking at a Verdant Catacombs, it could be 5, right? It could be anything.
Yeah, so, depending on which other black and green duels you have.
So yeah, when you're building your Golgari mana base or an Abzan mana base, that one dual land counts as 3 colors of sources, whereas the Overgrown Tomb would only count as 2, right? So that's why it just is infinitely easier to build functional mana bases in those fetch land formats.
But there was a while in Standard, the most recent Standard that had fetch lands. Well, not the most recent, I guess. Anyway, when Khans of Tarkir first came out, before Battle for Zendikar, there weren't fetchable duels. People were just fetching basics. And so then they were just like pretty good dual lands.
Yeah, exactly.
And so people still played a bunch of tapped tricolor lands, etc., to make up for the fact that they needed their colors.
Yeah, back in the day when the tricolor lands didn't have basic land types on them, so you couldn't fetch them.
Yeah, that's true. They didn't.
But once Battle for Zendikar came out, and it added the...
and everybody played 4 colors.
I can't remember what people did people call them Tango lands? Was that the name of it?
People tried to suggest Tango lands. They tried to suggest either Starbucks lands was a suggestion. I think they ended up just being called Battle lands.
Yeah, so these were the dual lands that had basic land types on them, but they entered play tapped unless you had two or more basics in play, right? Yeah, I can't.
So it's pretty common in the like Mardu green decks to fetch Plains Swamp, and then you would get an untapped red green duel.
Yeah, exactly.
Man, I miss those decks. Dark Jeskai, also a ton of fun.
Yeah. So we've talked about this article a little bit already, but if you want to find this article by Frank Karsten. It's called How Many Colored Mana Sources Do You Need to Consistently Cast Your Spells? The most recent update was October 10th, 2018. You can just Google that title and you'll find it. I'll also link
I just Googled Frank Karsten mana and it pops up.
Yeah.
So it's pretty well known.
I'll link to it in the description of the podcast and also in the description for the YouTube video if you're watching there. So,
and I guess one more caveat with this case study we're about to do and with this Frank Karsten article, different decks in different formats will have different subtle timing needs. They may have different amounts of untapped land needs. You might have, who knows? So as closely as you follow these guidelines to build your preliminary mana base, it's probably going to be fairly good, but you should always be open to tuning things based on play patterns and adjusting from there. So we won't have done that with these two decks that we're about to come up with mana bases for.
Yeah.
So if you want to take them for a spin, there might be some minor changes to it.
Exactly. So let's kick this case study off. We're going to start things off with Mardu, God Pharaoh's Gift. So you can pull up your deck list here if you're following along on Twitter or if you're watching on YouTube. Hello. So general idea of this deck, or a Gate to the Afterlife God Pharaoh's Gift deck. We have Crypt Breaker, Stitcher Supplier, and Bowmat Courier as our 1-drops. Our 2-drops are Seasoned Howlblade, Mire Triton, and 2 copies of Fiend Artisan. We have 4 Skyclave Apparition, 4 Combat Celebrant in the 3-drop slot alongside our Gate to the Afterlife. We have 2 Angel of Invention in a 5-drop slot, and then the 2 God Pharaoh's Gift up top. This is a total of 36 cards, so our mana base is going to be 24 lands. So notable.
That's the other thing I forgot to mention. I think most people agree at this point. If you're playing aggro / something slightly more aggressive, it's usually 23, 24. Mid-range decks hover around 25, 26. And I think most control decks now are like 27 plus lands, with Uro decks being an exception, going up to 30 sometimes just because of the put lands in play effect.
Exactly.
But the decks we've built here follow that rule. And it's just kind of, the slower you want to play, the more lands you need.
Yeah, specifically for this one, we kind of want to be able to hit 5 lands on turn 5 because going Gate into Sacrifice Gate is a pretty good sequence for a deck like this. So it might even be right to play more lands, but realistically, this deck only curves out to it, like its curve ends at 3 because we're not really ever looking to actually cast a God Pharaoh's Gift, hard cast it, or really hard cast an Angel of Invention either. It's nice if we could, if the opportunity comes up, but we're really just looking to, mill those or discard them. So 24 lands is what we've settled on.
Yeah. So first thing I noticed looking at this list is that there's basically no red. It would be nice to be able to have a red around to crack Bowmat Courier, but I'm not going to consider it as a requirement for a 1-drop. Combat Celebrant also doesn't really need to be cast. There might be games where we're discarding it in order to get creatures in the bin, or just because we're going to be able to reanimate it. So the red is very, very minor. I might consider this as needing a single red on 3, probably instead going to consider it as needing a single red on turn 4, and therefore, probably only need to play 8 or 9 red sources mixed into our other duels.
Yeah. So like we mentioned already, we're gonna start off by just looking at all the dual lands we have access to and then going from there. So if we start with just our shock lands, we have our Blood Crypts, we have our Sacred Foundries, we have our Godless Shrine. We can't ignore our Triomes since they kind of make things a little bit easier. But also, while the Triome here would do lots for making sure we fix our mana, this is not really a deck where we want our lands early to come into play tapped. So most likely, if we can make it work with color requirements, we're going to be trimming on those.
Yeah, and this is a deck that you're kind of aggressive and you have this combo finish. So yeah, as much as we said sort of consider all the duels, I think it's somewhat fair to trim back on Savaya Triomes and off the bat say that we're not going to play Temples because we probably pretty realistically need to go 1, 2, 3. So it makes me want to lean into Shock Check, which is a mana base that can pretty consistently be always untapped.
Exactly, yeah. So let's pull in all of our options for Shock Check. We have Clifftop Retreats for red-white. We have Isolated Chapels for black-white. And we have Dragon Skull Summit for black-red. And then the other lands we will want to consider here, of course, are pathways. So we have Bright Climb Pathway, and then we have our Needle Verge Pathway. And then finally, Kaladesh also added our fast lands. So we have Inspiring Vantage for red-white, and we have Concealed Courtyard for black-white. Now, this could be a deck where these fast lands are actually pretty good because we want to be casting our Stitcher Supplier, our Crypt Breaker on turn 1. Notably, though, our color requirements for turn 1, Bowmat Courier is easy. We can cast it with whatever. But all of our 1-drops are black. So if I was looking to be playing a fast land, I would automatically kind of rule out Inspiring Vantage off the bat for that reason, because it doesn't cast our Crypt Breakers or our Stitcher Supplier. And looking at our 2-drops as well, we have 2 Fiend Artisan, 2 Mire Triton, 4 Seasoned Hallowblade. Our Courtyard can cast all of those cards, whereas the Vantage doesn't contribute to our color requirements for at all for Fiend Artisan. And while it can cast a Seasoned Hallowblade, it doesn't help us with black for Mire Triton. So I already kind of want to rule out Inspiring Vantage as an option, but we'll just leave it here for now so we can take a look at everything we have here. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm just going to move all of our lands over here so you can clearly see all of our options.
Yeah, we're basically, a black-white deck that plays up to turn 3. So I feel like it's pretty safe to just keep all the black-white duels and see how many lands we have.
All right, so we'll start with how many color, since red is our thing we think we can kind of skimp out on, because really we need one source for Bowmat Courier a bit later, and then Combat Settlement we're not really worried about. I think 9 or 10 sources we can get away with. So we already have 8, starting off with our shock lands, Sacred Foundry and Blood Crypt. Now, our deck is essentially base black-white, so that automatically makes me want to trim on Dragon Skull Summits, because I'd rather my red source also produce white. And Dragon Skull Summit, in particular, it doesn't help us cast those turn 1 Crypt Breakers or Stitcher Suppliers, right?
Yeah. Would we rather trim Dragon Skull than Clifftop? Well, I think our black requirements are a bit stricter.
It's going to come down to how important is the white, right?
Like, what if we... trying to think here. Okay, here, what's this as like a first idea? What if we don't play Sacred Foundry, but we play Inspiring Vantage? So we play Godless Shrine, Blood Crypt, Concealed Courtyard, Inspiring Vantage. Bright Climb Pathway, Isolated Chapel. How many lands is that? Yeah, so I'm wondering if you could just maybe move the Sacred Foundries to the right so we can see what this looks like. And then keep both fast lands. Keep the Bright Climb Pathway and the Isolated Chapels. Because now this is base black-white. We have 8 red sources. Our red sources can always enter untapped if needed. The Isolated Chapels might be a bit suspect here. They might be entering tapped a bit too often because we don't actually have that many mountains or maybe just playing the Sacred Foundry over Inspiring Vantage is better to get the Isolated Chapels untapped.
This is something I wanted to make note of as well. I think specifically because we want to play a couple check lands, it would be better to make the easy swap out for Sacred Foundry instead of Inspiring Vantage, so we can up the amount of sources we have to make sure Isolated Chapel does enter play untapped. So looking at this mana base here, 4 Bright Climb Pathway, 4 Courtyard, 4 Godless Shrine, 4 Chapel, 4 Blood Crypt, 4 Sacred Foundry. That leaves us at 24 lands. So if we're looking for our colored sources on turn 1 for Stitcher's Supplier for black, we have 4, 8, 12 pathway counts. So we'll count it as 16, but it's only kind of half.
Yeah, even if you count it as 2, we're at 14, which is what Frank Carson recommends. So I think we're good for turn 1 black. We're almost certainly good for turn 2 white. Double black on 2, though, to cast Fiend Artisan. We want 20 black sources.
Yeah, so this is where it gets a little bit hairy. We actually have 20. If you assume Bright Climb Pathway is a black source. The problem is because it's a pathway, it's not actually both. So I would only count it as half. So we're a little short on that. So we'd be at 18 instead of 20. But I kind of think that might be okay in this scenario because it's not like we're playing 4 Fiend Artisan. And it's not really the end of the world if we have to cast it on turn 3.
That's true. I mean, the other thing we could do, like we kind of built this to avoid a lot of tap lands, but we could also like maybe cut 2 Sacred Foundries for 2 Savai Triomes.
Yeah, that would also solve our problem as well.
Because then, yeah, that keeps the number of red and white sources all the same, shores up the black sources a little bit more. It's a tap land, but, you know, maybe we can find room for it. Maybe we don't have a 1-drop. That's going to happen sometimes. We can go tap land into black source and cast the Fiend Artisan. And even if it's disrupting our curve a bit, maybe the cycling is something that's useful later. This is the sort of thing that in play patterns, like if this card's too awkward, then you go back.
Exactly. So, the Triome gets us to those 20 sources for Fiend Artisan if we're counting the Bright Climb Pathway as half. For red, we're sitting at 8 sources for
that's about
basically Bomat Courier, and like we're kind of not really counting Combat Celebrant, right? So I think 8 sources is okay. And then when we're looking at white, our main concern is can we cast Skyclave Apparition on turn 3 the majority of the time. So we want to have somewhere around 18 sources. So right now, I'm still going to count Bright Climb Pathway as half.
I mean, this is symmetric in black and white, right? So isn't it? Or is there slightly more black?
I think there's slightly more black. If we're looking at white, we have 4 down here, 4 with the Foundries and the Triomes, 8, 12, 16, and then count
18.
Pathway as 2. So that's 18.
Yeah, so that's what we're looking for.
Yeah, that's bang on from what we would want. So really, we could just go with this.
Yeah, so the only thing, so we're pretty good on black and white. The Combat Celebrant, like we're a bit light on red. So if we could find some way to fit in more red sources, I would be interested, but I'm not sure we can do that without disrupting our other colors, because to not disrupt black or white, we would need more tri-lands. I guess you could do something like play some basics and Fabled Passage, and the Fabled Passage will count as triple, but then your basics only count as 1, and you're introducing more tap lands, which I think is not what this deck wants.
Yeah, Fabled Passage obviously is a consideration here, but the problem with Fabled Passage is it requires I
don't think it is a consideration.
If you are considering Fabled Passage, right? You have to think about how many basics you have to play. And with how restrictive some of the mana costs in this deck, I don't really think you can afford to do it. As well as with our deck essentially curving out at 3, we don't want more lands that come into play tapped on turn 1, 2, and 3. We're already stretching it kind of thin with 2 Savad Triomes, right? So I think Fabled Passage isn't something we really want to consider for a deck like this.
Yeah, I agree. Needing double white on 3, double black on 2 with a red potentially, yeah, it doesn't really leave much room for basics or things like Fabled Passage, which ultimately is just a single colored source. Even these pathways are kind of a bit awkward. Yeah. Changes that I might make here, or changes that I would keep in mind. Like, I think this is a good place to start, but changes I would keep in mind if I were going to play this deck is watching how often the isolated chapels are entering tapped. If it's relatively often, maybe you could go to like 3 chapels and play a third Savai Triome to shore up the red, since they're going to be tapped kind of anyway. But if they're mostly entering untapped, then you can leave them.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah, like one other change we could make here, realistically, is we could turn, Bright Climb Pathway into 2 Dragon Skull Summits, and we could turn the other 2 into 2 Clifftop Retreats, right? And that gets us to our...
Yeah, it's counted the same, and it adds red sources.
It adds 4 red sources, and it's kind of counted the same. The only problem, though, by doing that is while we still have the same amount of black sources in our deck, I guess since we're only counting Bright Climb Pathway 4 copies as 2 black sources, it doesn't help us. It actually makes us slightly less consistent for casting a black card on turn 1.
That's true.
Because the Dragon Soul Summits enter play tapped on turn 1. So it's a pretty easy change we can make if we're worried about our red requirements. But we're giving up, like, the sacrifice we're making to make us a little bit more consistently to cast a Combat Celebrant on turn 3 is giving up our consistency for casting a black card on turn 1. And
I think the black cards are more important.
Considering what our game plan here is with a Mardu Godpharaoh's Gift deck, we want to cast our Cryptbreaker or our Stitcher Supplier on turn 1. It's way more important to do that than it is to cast a Combat Celebrant on turn 3, because we don't want to cast Combat Celebrant in most scenarios. We just want to discard it or mill it. So while we are technically by the numbers a little bit short on our red, in the grand scheme of things, I think this is a scenario where it's okay to make a sacrifice there.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so this is how we would throw together our mana base. If you're listening for the podcast, we have 4 Concealed Courtyards, 4 Godless Shrines, 4 Isolated Chapels, 4 Bright Climb Pathway, 2 Blood Crypt, 2 Sacred Foundry, and 2 Savai Triomes.
4 Blood Crypt. Did you say 2?
I thought I said 4. It's 4 Blood Crypt, 2 Sacred Foundries, 2 Savai Triomes. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see this all pretty clearly in front of me here. And that's kind of how we would do it. So if you did the case study before, take a look at your mana base, compare it to ours, listen to our reasoning, see how we did it. If you did something a little bit different or have actually thought about a way to do it better, tweet at us at DWC Podcast 1, shoot us a message on Twitter, Facebook, or if you're watching on YouTube, link it in the comments, because I'd actually be really interested to discuss if you found a way to do it better. But I actually like our reasoning here for this one.
Yeah, and that's my general pattern. Like, based on archetype and curve considerations, what type of duels do I want? And then balancing those duels for color.
Exactly, yeah. So let's change things up here and move to our next deck for our case study. I think this one's going to be a little more difficult because the mana costs in this deck are kind of all over the place.
All right, this deck is great. A brief overview of this deck. I played Saheeli a lot in Standard even after Felidar Guardian got banned, so I was just feeling nostalgic. And I was trying to think of interesting ways to use Saheeli, which let me searching through the creatures for things with ETBs. And I realized you could use Burning Tree Emissary. But if you don't have to cast the Burning Tree Emissary, you just copy it. It's basically 2 free mana. Which means if you copy a Burning Tree Emissary on turn 4, you have 6 mana. And there's nothing more worthwhile to do with 6 mana in Historic than cast Gearhulks. So that's what this deck is. It's got the food package to help ramp a bit. The Wicked Wolf was there just as like an analog to Ravenous Chupacabra, so that Saheeli could potentially be a removal spell.
Yeah, here. So I'll actually, for the listeners, anyone who isn't watching on YouTube, I'll list out the cards in this deck so you can kind of get an idea of how crazy it is. We have 4 Gilded Goose, 4 Burning Tree Emissary, 4 Scorching Dragonfire, 2 Abrade, 1 Tail's End, 1 Essence Scatter, 1 Supreme Will, 4 Saheeli Rai, 2 Glimmer of Genius, 4 Wicked Wolf, 2 Combustible Gearhulk, 2 Sublime Epiphany, and 3 Torrential Gearhulk. So if you're kind of picturing these cards in your head as you're listening to it, you can kind of see that the mana requirements in this deck are all over the place. We have green on 1. We have green-red hybrid ×2 on turn 2. We have blue-red 1 on 3. Green-green 2 on 4. Red 4. Blue 4 on 6. It's kind of all over the place.
All right. So I admit and I acknowledge that it looks all over the place at first, but what I want to point out is that, is the following. To cast Gilded Goose on 1, you need a lot of green sources. Burning Tree Emissary is double Gearhulk hybrid, so that also kind of requires a lot of green sources, and Wicked Wolf has a lot of green sources. And these are sort of the permanents you'll be casting early. The removal spells, the counter magic, which are red and blue, even though they're 2 CMC, you can kind of sometimes afford to wait. And then the Sublime Epiphany and the Gearhulks are 6 mana, and so the fact that they're double colored is a lot less impactful because you have more time to find more lands to hit those requirements. So the idea then is going to be to play a bunch of green-based duels so that ideally on turn 2 we have like a green-red duel and a green-blue duel, unlocking our blue cards, our red cards, and all these double green cards. So I think, it looks all over the place, but if you have a green-centered mana base within blue and red kind of as feature colors, you can sort of just build a blue-red mana base that happens to have a lot of green in it, where that will work out for this.
Yeah, and also something to consider here is while we have 4 Gilded Goose, our curve technically just starts on 2, and it's not really the end of the world if we don't cast a Gilded Goose on turn 1. So when we're considering something like a Temur Triome for a deck like this, I'd be a lot happier to play 4 copies of the Triome because of how all over the place our mana costs are in this deck in particular. Because not only do we have less green 1-drops on turn 1, but it also doesn't really matter if we cast it on turn 1 as compared to the Mardu deck, where in pretty much every game, we always want to cast a 1-drop on turn 1. So starting off here, I'm pretty much always just going to add 4 Ketria Triome to the deck.
Yeah, I agree. I think another thing is because this deck is a bit inconsistent, to help with that, we probably want some scry lands. Since we're playing 26 lands in this case, I think 5 or 6 tap lands is fine. So I probably want like a couple green-based scry lands.
Yeah, Scrylands would definitely be a consideration in this deck for all those reasons you said, whereas, we didn't even consider them in our last deck because we want to curve out on the first 3 turns. So starting here, we have the 4 Triomes, and we're going to pull all of our Shockland possibilities out. So our 4 Steam Vents, our 4 Stomping Grounds, our 4 Breeding Pools. Let's take some Temples over here, just so we can consider them.
Maybe like 1 Mystery, 1 Abandon.
Let's pull just 2 of each color combination into the mana base, just so we have them here to look at.
Sure.
Let's consider our check lands. So our 4 Hinterland Harbors. We have our Falls, Sulphur Falls. And then our green ones, which are... What's the name of the green ones?
Rootbound Crag?
Crag, yeah. Okay.
This is also a deck where I think we're fine. Because we're playing more lands, we're playing 2 extra lands, we have room for some Fabled Passage basics. And because this deck is playing later, up until turn, 4, 5, 6, late game Fabled Passage allows you, like, maybe you've drawn mana that's fine, but you're missing, like, a second blue source. Fabled Passage allows you to shore up these color requirements you may need for your, like, 4 and 6 drops.
Yeah, we'll add one copy of every basic into the deck that we could possibly want and build from there. So one forest, one island, one mountain, and then adjust the numbers based on that.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll group our basics and our fabled passages together here. We'll group our temples over here.
Yeah, so already, because of these burning tree emissaries, we want a lot of green and red sources. So, I mean, every one of these lands can make green or red. So we're like automatically good there. So then what we're kind of trying to balance is, I think, do we have enough green sources for Goose? And we're considering that we're fine casting it on turn 2, which means we only need like 13 sources.
Exactly, yeah. So we're looking at a total land count in this deck of 26. It could be right to play more than that, but we're just going to consider 26 to start. I think the 4 Triome, 4 Breeding Pool, 4 Stomping Ground, 4 Steam Vents are probably all going to be are all going to stay the same. The only thing that might not be 4 copies is the Steam Vents, I could say, because Steam Vents doesn't contribute to that turn 1 Gilded Goose.
Because they're not turn 1 green, and also this type of deck, like, it's pretty greedy in what it's trying to pull off, casting Burning Trees and sometimes like just naked Saheelis. So it's a deck that might lose if it has to shock itself too much. So I'm also a bit hesitant to play, because we have no life gain, to play 12 shocks.
Yeah, so for the reason I already mentioned, let's just start by trimming 2 Steam Vents.
Mm-hmm.
And then
the next thing is, I think we probably don't want 6 temples. I think we maybe want 1 or 2.
And for the reasons you already mentioned that we talked about with Steam Vents, I think we'd more likely lean towards our green duels. So Temple of Epiphany is kind of is one we're gonna cut for now. So we have 2 Temple of Mystery, 2 Temple of Abandon, and you said you only wanted to play 2. So are we?
Probably, I don't know, just go like 1 and 1.
We'll start with 1 and 1, and then we can adjust that based on what our color requirements are as we get more down. So if we're looking at just the lands that we have, considered for the main deck right now, which is this pile here, which is the 4 Triomes, our 10 shock lands, and then 1 copy of Temple of Mystery, 1 copy of Temple of Abandon. Looking at green, this is 9, 10, 14. So 14 sources gets us to our color requirements for our Gilded Goose.
1, 2, yeah. If we could fit in a bit more, that would be nice. And I think we can if we play the Fabled Passage and some forests. But for Goose on 2, we're kind of already there.
Yeah, Goose on 2, we're there. It's actually good enough for Goose on 1 as well, but we're considering our tap lands as turn 1 green sources, which you can't really do. So
yeah. So the tap lands don't really count. So for Goose on 1, we only have 8. So we would like a few more if possible.
Yeah, looking at our requirements for our Wicked Wolf, which is our next kind of really restrictive green card, we would want to have around 16 sources. So we're too short there. So we have to try and make that up with either Fabled Passage or some of our check lands here.
So as long as we make sure that we can cast Gilded Goose consistently kind of early, we can count the 4 Gilded Goose as 1 or 2 tricolor sources as well, because it is a mana dork.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah.
So
right now with this core here, we are sitting at 16 lands. So we have room for 10 more. So we can shore up our green with some basics and with the Fabled Passage if we want to go there.
Yeah, I think. What if we start with like 3 Fabled Passage, 1 island, 1 mountain, 2 forest? You want to have enough basics when you're playing Passage that they don't become dead draws late game. I think 5 is safe, but we can start at 4.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's only 3 Fabled Passage, so I think that's okay. And then so the forests get us up to our requirements on their own, and then the Fabled Passage just kind of give us some extra wiggle room there. Yeah. So out of our 10 remaining lands, these 7 that we've added leaves us with 3 to work with.
I think we're good on color requirements now, all across the curve. Saheeli, for 2, I guess it's 1 and a color and 1 and a color. So for Saheeli on 3, we want about 11 red and 11 blue. I think we're there pretty easily.
Yeah, looking at red right now, it'd be 4, 5, 9, 10, 11, 12, plus 3 Fabled Passage.
Yeah, so I think we're actually good on all of our color requirements now with these duels and the Fabled Passage basics plan without any of our check lands. So with 3 extra slots for lands now, we could shore up some of our colors with these harbors, but I think this is maybe a good example. All of our color requirements are good. Our number of tap lands to untap lands seems fine. And so I actually played this deck for a few hours on ladder one day, trying to see if I would make it work. And it can't really deal with the crawling barons. And maybe some castles on the opposing sides might be annoying. And since our color requirements are so good, we can play like a Field of Ruin.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. So we have 3 slots left. So if we want to add Field of Ruin in, just a copy.
Yeah, just 1. Like, as much as our color requirements are satisfied here, the deck is still pretty color heavy. It does interfere a lot with Burning Tree Emissary, so it might actually mess up some draws pretty badly. So I don't want to play any more than 1 colorless land, but you know, I think it's something that you can safely mix in. And then for our other cards, I mean, most of our deck is green. I think our green sources are quite good. I don't know, we could play like 2 green checks, maybe. I don't know, I think it's pretty open.
Yeah, I think for the same reasons that we already talked about earlier, we probably just won't want to Sulfur Falls.
Or maybe these last 2 slots should be some dual face land. It doesn't really matter what, so long as it's useful, because our colors are good. So maybe they should be like Shatter Skull Smashings.
If I could spell. All right.
Now, well, okay, maybe we don't want to do this because now the smashings are considered part of the mana base, and so if you ever cast them, okay, when you do this, I guess it's just good to keep in mind that like it's a land first before it's a spell, whereas in a lot of decks it's a spell first that could be a land if needed. So you're looking to have them as like a late game option, but you should be willing to play it early if needed.
Yeah. So, looking at this, like we could have also gone a different way with the mana base. Like we didn't have to play the Fabled Passage with the basics. We could have played more check lands if we wanted to do that, or just not played Fabled Passage, played check lands. So I guess something to consider here with this 3-color deck is I do like having access to basics, because there are decks in the format that, you know, might Field of Ruin us at some point. And our color requirements are kind of spread out across our curve more than they were in the last deck with Mardu, where in Mardu we didn't play any basic lands, but our color requirements were a little more tight for the early turn, so we couldn't really afford to do that. Whereas this deck, there's a lot more. While kind of on the surface it seems like our mana requirements might be a little bit harder because they're more all over the place, because we have more expensive cards in our deck, it actually makes things a little bit easier, and we can be a little bit more loose with things.
Yeah, the color requirements for expensive cards are easier to hit, and we're just playing 2 extra lands because our deck is more expensive, which gives us a bunch of room as well.
Yeah. So now with how we've settled, our mana base is 2 steam vents, 4 stomping grounds, 4 breeding pools, 4 Ketria Triome, 1 Temple of Mystery, 1 Temple of Abandon, 1 Field of Ruin, 3 Fabled Passage, 2 Forest, 1 Mountain, 1 Island, and then 2 Shatter Skull Smashing as a modal double face land. This brings us in for green sources at 10, 14, 16, 19 technical sources. I'm not going to count Field of Ruin as a source. For blue, brings us in at 9, 10, 11, 12, 15 sources. And then for red, it brings us in at 4, 5, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15 sources. So more green than everything else. And then our blue and our red are tied.
Yeah, and that's about what we were aiming for. Things to keep in mind if you take this for a spin and want to maybe make some changes. Despite the Field of Ruin not interfering with the number of color requirements, if it interferes with the color requirements in your curve too often, just like scrap it. It's not as important as hitting your colors.
And I actually miscounted too, because for red, it's actually 2 more. It's 17 because I didn't count Shatter Skull Smashing.
Oh, yeah.
Which actually works out in our benefit as well, because we have more red cards on turn 2 than we have blue. So going, green, red, blue from most sources to least actually works in our favor.
Yeah, sweet.
So yeah, this is how we would build it if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on the podcast, you can check it out. I'll tweet our lists out as well, what we did for the case study. It'll probably be in the thread for the original post, so you can see where we landed off, or you can just watch the YouTube video if you're interested in the process. And yeah, actually, this was fun. I like this whole case study approach for
just doing it off the cuff.
Yeah.
As a summary, come up with a list of the duels that you might want to play. If you want to play tap duels, if you don't want to play tap duels, etc. And then balance for color.
Exactly. So yeah, if like I said, for the Mardu list, if you came up with something different for the Temur list and think your mana base is a little bit better, leave it in the YouTube comments, tweet at us, send us a message. Happy to discuss anything. And like Cam also talked about earlier, while, theoretically for both these decks, the mana bases work for color requirements, you're also going to learn more by actually playing the decks. So as you get games in, you'll notice things about the mana base that you won't notice just from, this perspective of throwing it together in a deck list. So you can make adjustments based on how the mana base plays out from there. Just because you started with this build doesn't mean you're hard walked into these choices.
Yeah, for sure. And these numbers coming from the Frank Carson article are based on you should be able to cast your cards whatever percentage of the time. And it's assuming that that's equally important for all decks and all cards. Maybe you're an aggro deck that is so aggressive that you have absolutely no late game. And if you don't cast your 3-drop on 3, it's not good enough on turn 4. Then obviously you need to go above the color requirements from this article. And those are things you'll notice as you play.
Yeah, exactly.